The alien king's desperate decision. The grand hall of the Zarinthian palace was as cold as its ruler. King Zillar sat on his ornate throne, his expression unyielding as he surveyed the room. Before him, rows of alien nobles whispered among themselves, their glittering robes reflecting the pale blue light of the floating crystal chandeliers. At the center of the hall, Princess Lixera stood trembling, her slender frame barely able to support her weight. Lixera was the king's only child, but to the Zarinthian people, she was a disappointment. Born with a fragile body, she could barely handle the gravity of her home planet. Her pale skin glistened with an unnatural sheen, and her legs wavered as if they might give out at any moment. The nobles pitied her, but their pity was laced with contempt. What use was a princess who could not even defend herself, let alone rule a kingdom? The room fell silent as King Zillar rose. His deep voice echoed across the hall. "Today, I announce a decision that will shock many of you." His piercing gaze swept across the crowd, daring anyone to challenge him. "My daughter, Lixera, will leave this palace. She will no longer be protected by our guards or shielded by her title. Instead, she will be entrusted to a human." A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. Whispers turned into gasps, and gasps into murmurs of outrage. "A human," one noblewoman exclaimed. "They are weak, primitive creatures. How can you?" "Enough," the king thundered, his voice silencing the crowd instantly. He stepped down from the throne and approached his daughter, who flinched under his gaze. "Lixera's weakness has shamed our lineage. She must prove her worth, and she will do so on Earth. If she survives, she will return stronger. If not—" He paused, letting the unspoken truth hang in the air. "Then she was never meant to rule." The nobles exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to argue further. King Zillar's word was law. At that moment, the doors to the hall creaked open. A tall, rugged man stepped inside, his human features starkly different from the alien elegance surrounding him. His name was Ethan, a survivalist from Earth, known for his resilience and unorthodox methods. His brown eyes scanned the room with calm indifference, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "This is the human you've chosen," one of the nobles sneered, their tone dripping with disdain. "He looks no more capable than a child." Ethan smirked but said nothing, his silence more unnerving than any retort. He stopped a few feet away from the king and crossed his arms. "So," he said, his voice steady and firm, "this is the princess I'm supposed to train." Lixera's cheeks flushed with humiliation as Ethan's gaze settled on her. She felt like a fragile glass figurine under his scrutiny. Before she could muster the courage to speak, her father answered. "Yes," King Zillar said, his tone icy. "She is your responsibility now. Take her to your world. Teach her how to survive. If she fails, she will not return." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what do I get out of this deal?" The king's eyes narrowed. "You will be well rewarded, human. Gold, technology, whatever your kind desires. But know this, if you fail to return her alive, your life will be forfeit." Ethan chuckled softly. Harsh terms, but fair. He turned to Lixera, his expression softening slightly. "Listen, kid. If you want to survive, you'll have to forget everything you've ever known. Your title, your comforts, your pride. It all means nothing on Earth. Out there, it's you against the world." Lixera's voice trembled as she finally spoke. "Why do I have to leave? I'm not ready for this. I'll die." "Then prove me wrong," King Zillar interrupted coldly. "Prove to me that you are more than the weakling everyone believes you to be." Tears welled up in Lixera's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned to Ethan, who gave her a small nod. His confidence was unsettling, but it also sparked a flicker of determination within her. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go." The king gestured toward the grand doors, where two guards stood waiting to escort Lixera and Ethan to the transport ship. As they began to leave, the nobles erupted into heated discussions. Some called the king cruel, while others praised his boldness. Lixera didn't look back. She couldn't. The weight of her father's words was too heavy. As they stepped onto the ship, Ethan glanced at her and said, "You're scared. That's good. It means you're still alive. But if you want to stay that way, you're going to have to fight for it." Lixera nodded, clutching the edges of her thin robe. The ship's engines roared to life, and within moments they were hurtling toward Earth. Lixera stared out the window, her homeworld growing smaller and smaller until it was just a dot in the vastness of space. She didn't know what awaited her on Earth, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. Earth's harsh trials. The transport ship's landing gear hissed as it settled onto the forest clearing. Lixera stepped out cautiously, her alien eyes adjusting to the vibrant greens and browns of Earth's wilderness. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp soil, and strange, distant calls of unseen creatures echoed through the trees. For a moment, she marveled at the chaotic beauty of this world, a stark contrast to the sterile, crystalline landscapes of her home planet. Ethan stepped out behind her, slinging a worn backpack over his shoulder. "Welcome to Earth," he said, his voice laced with dry amusement. "Home to everything that wants to eat you, sting you, or make you regret waking up." Lixera shot him a glare, but her confidence faltered as she surveyed the dense forest. The towering trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their shadows forming shifting patterns on the ground. Every rustle in the undergrowth made her flinch, her overactive imagination conjuring images of fanged predators and venomous insects. Ethan noticed her hesitation. "Rule number 1, he said, crouching to inspect the tracks on the ground. "Fear is your enemy. The more you panic, the less you think. And out here, not thinking will get you killed." "I wasn't panicking," Lixera muttered, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Ethan stood, brushing dirt off his hands. "Sure you weren't. Now let's get something straight. I'm not here to coddle you or hold your hand. If you want to survive, you'll do exactly as I say. Got it?" She nodded reluctantly, her pride bruised. Back home, her royal title had shielded her from criticism. Here, it seemed, she was just another liability. Ethan led her deeper into the forest, his movements purposeful and precise. He seemed to navigate the maze of trees effortlessly, while Lixera stumbled over roots and slipped on damp rocks. Her alien physiology, while graceful in controlled environments, was clumsy in this untamed terrain. After an hour of trekking, Ethan stopped abruptly. "We'll set up camp here," he said, dropping his pack onto the ground. He pointed to a pile of branches nearby. "Start gathering firewood. We'll need it before nightfall." Lixera blinked. "You expect me to do manual labor?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Do you see anyone else around? Unless you've got a secret servant hiding somewhere, you'd better get moving." Grumbling under her breath, Lixera began collecting sticks and twigs, her delicate hands struggling to grip the rough wood. By the time she returned, Ethan had already constructed a rudimentary shelter using branches and a tarp from his pack. He glanced at her pile of firewood and frowned. "That's it. A stiff breeze could put that out." "I'm not used to this," she snapped, dropping the wood in frustration. "I wasn't trained to be. Whatever this is." Ethan sighed and crouched down to her level. "Look, princess, I get it. You're out of your comfort zone. But you've got two choices: adapt or die. The forest doesn't care who you are. Neither do I." Lixera swallowed her retort, his words hitting harder than she expected. She watched as he effortlessly arranged the wood into a teepee shape and struck a match. The fire crackled to life, its warmth a small comfort against the encroaching chill. As night fell, the forest came alive with strange sounds. Owls hooted, leaves rustled, and the occasional distant howl sent shivers down Lixera's spine. She sat close to the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. "What's out there?" she asked quietly. "Everything," Ethan replied, sharpening a stick with his knife. "Wolves, bears, snakes, some harmless, some not. You'll learn to tell the difference. Her gaze drifted to the darkness beyond the firelight. "And if I don't?" Ethan's knife paused mid-sharpen. "Then you won't make it to sunrise." The gravity of his words sank in, and Lixura felt a lump form in her throat. She was a stranger in a hostile world, with no allies except a human who barely tolerated her. For the first time, she truly understood the weight of her father's decision. This wasn't just a test, it was a death sentence unless she proved otherwise. As the hours dragged on, fatigue began to weigh on her. She leaned against a tree, her eyelids heavy. Just as sleep was about to claim her, a low growl broke the silence. Her eyes snapped open, and she froze. A pair of glowing eyes stared at her from the shadows, their intent unmistakable. "Ethan," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. He was already on his feet, his sharpened stick in hand. "Don't move," he ordered, his tone deadly serious. The creature stepped into the firelight, a massive, snarling predator with razor-sharp claws and teeth designed for tearing flesh. Lixura's heart pounded as the beast lunged toward her. She braced for the inevitable, but Ethan intercepted it mid-air, driving his makeshift spear into its side. The creature howled in pain, thrashing wildly as Ethan wrestled it to the ground. With a final brutal thrust, he ended its life. Panting, Ethan wiped the blood from his face and turned to Lixura. "Rule number 2, always be ready to fight." Lixura stared at him, her fear mingling with newfound respect. She realized then that survival on Earth wasn't just about learning skills. It was about becoming something she'd never been before, a fighter. As the firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the forest floor, Lixura made a silent vow. She would survive, not for her father's approval, but for herself. This world would not break her. And it all started here, in the heart of Earth's untamed wilderness. First spark of strength. The morning sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Lixura stirred, wincing as she felt the ache in her limbs from the previous day's trek. Every muscle in her body protested, and her delicate alien skin bore scratches and bruises from her stumbles through the underbrush. Ethan was already awake, crouched by the fire as he prepared a small meal of roasted tubers he had dug up earlier. His movements were efficient, methodical, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. When he noticed her stirring, he tossed her one of the tubers. "Eat, you'll need your strength." Lixura caught it awkwardly, examining the charred surface with a grimace. "You expect me to eat this? It looks like something that fell off a starship engine." Ethan smirked. "Out here, you eat what you can find. Luxury is for people who don't have to worry about starving." She hesitated, but her growling stomach left her no choice. Taking a tentative bite, she was surprised by the earthy, slightly sweet flavor. It wasn't the delicately crafted meals she was accustomed to back home, but it was food. She chewed silently, her pride preventing her from admitting it wasn't as bad as she expected. As she finished eating, Ethan stood and slung his pack over his shoulder. "Today, you're going to learn the basics of survival," he announced, starting with finding food and water. "You'll do it on your own." Lixura blinked in disbelief. "On my own? I barely managed to keep up with you yesterday." "And that's why you need to learn," Ethan replied, his tone firm. "I won't always be around to hold your hand. If you're going to survive, you need to figure things out for yourself." He handed her a crude knife and pointed to the forest. "Find something edible. Stay close enough to hear me call, but far enough to rely on your own judgment. If you pick something poisonous, well, you'll learn from the mistake." Her eyes widened. "Poisonous?" He shrugged. "Survival isn't about perfection. It's about learning fast." Reluctantly, Lixura trudged into the forest, clutching the knife tightly. The dense foliage seemed to close in around her, every rustle and chirp setting her nerves on edge. She scanned the ground for anything that resembled the tuber Ethan had roasted, but all she found were strange, unfamiliar plants. As the minutes dragged on, her frustration grew. "This is pointless," she muttered, kicking the rock in frustration. "I'm not a scavenger." Her self-pity was interrupted by the sound of running water. Following the noise, she came across a small stream, its crystal-clear surface sparkling in the sunlight. Relief washed over her as she knelt by the water's edge, cupping her hands to drink. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat, and for the first time since arriving on Earth, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Nearby, she spotted a cluster of berries growing on a bush. They were small and bright red, their glossy skin practically inviting her to pluck them. Hunger gnawed at her, but Ethan's warning echoed in her mind. Poisonous. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between the berries and the forest around her. A low growl from her stomach pushed her to action. Using the knife, she carefully cut a single berry from the bush and held it up for inspection. It didn't smell unusual, but that meant little to someone unfamiliar with Earth's flora. Taking a deep breath, she remembered something Ethan had mentioned the night before. Test in small amounts, he'd said. If it's poisonous, your body will react quickly. With a mix of fear and determination, she bit into the berry, tasting its sweet and slightly tart flavor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sharp burning sensation spread across her tongue, and she spat the berry out, coughing and gagging. Her throat tightened, and panic set in as she struggled to breathe. Suddenly, Ethan's voice rang out from behind her. Breathe through your nose. Slow and steady. She turned to see him standing a few feet away, his expression calm but watchful. He crouched beside her and handed her a small leaf. Chew this. It'll neutralize the toxin. Lixura grabbed the leaf and bit into it, relief flooding her as the burning sensation began to fade. She slumped to the ground, her chest heaving. You were following me, she gasped. Of course, Ethan said matter-of-factly. I wasn't going to let you die on day 2. But you needed to make that mistake yourself. Now you know, those berries are off limits. Frustration bubbled to the surface. You could have warned me. And would you have learned as quickly? Ethan shot back. Survival isn't about being told what to do. It's about figuring it out, even when the stakes are high. His words stung, but Lixura couldn't deny their truth. She looked down at the stream, her reflection distorted by the rippling water. The weak, frightened princess she saw wasn't who she wanted to be. Not anymore. Ethan stood and offered her a hand. Come on, let's head back. Tomorrow, we'll work on traps. She took his hand, her grip stronger than it had been the day before. As they walked back to camp, a thought began to take root in her mind. She wasn't just surviving, she was changing. Earth's trials were harsh, but they were awakening something within her, something that felt a lot like strength. And for the first time, Lixura found herself looking forward to what came next. A hidden threat. The forest was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Lixura crouched low behind a thick bush, her breathing steady but shallow as Ethan had taught her. Her hand clutched the crude spear she had fashioned from a sturdy branch and a sharpened rock, though it felt more like a twig compared to the weight of her fear. She scanned her surroundings, her keen alien eyes picking up every flicker of movement. Something, or someone, was watching her. Ethan had gone ahead earlier to scout the area, leaving Lixura to practice setting snares on her own. She had felt a surge of confidence at first, her traps steadily improving with each attempt. But then, the uneasy sensation of being followed began to creep over her. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, a remnant of her earlier fears. But the shadows seemed to move with purpose now, and the faint rustling of leaves was too deliberate to be caused by mere wind. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind her. Lixura spun around, her spear at the ready, but saw nothing. Her heart raced as she backed away, the forest seeming to close in around her. Ethan, she called softly, though she doubted he was within earshot. Another sound, a low guttural growl, sent a chill down her spine. This was no earth predator. It was something else, something far more dangerous. She gripped her spear tighter, her mind racing. She could run, but the creature sounded close. Too close. If it was fast, she wouldn't make it far. Then, from the shadows, it emerged. The figure was humanoid but unmistakably alien, its skin a mottled gray-green with jagged black patterns running across its sinewy body. Its eyes glowed faintly, slitted and predatory, and its clawed hands gripped a weapon that looked like a cross between a blade and a plasma emitter. It stood at least a foot taller than Ethan, and radiated an aura of menace that made Lixira's blood run cold. She recognized the markings on its armor. It was one of her father's elite enforcers. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she expected. The enforcer tilted its head, regarding her with disdain. "I could ask you the same, princess." It sneered, the words dripping with contempt. "But it seems the king has finally given up on his weakling daughter, sending you to this wasteland. Pathetic." Lixira's grip tightened on her spear, anger flaring in her chest. "If my father sent you to kill me, you'll find I'm not as weak as you think." The enforcer laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Kill you? No, princess. My orders are to ensure you don't survive. But if you insist on fighting—" It raised its weapon, the plasma edge glowing ominously. "I won't hold back." The fight was over before it even began. Lixira lunged forward, thrusting her spear with all her strength, but the enforcer sidestepped effortlessly, swiping at her with its claws. She barely managed to duck, her spear snapping as it collided with the creature's armored forearm. She stumbled, falling to the ground as the enforcer loomed over her. "Pathetic," it growled, raising its weapon for the killing blow. But before it could strike, a blur of motion crashed into the enforcer, sending it sprawling. Lixira blinked in shock as Ethan stood over her, his mashie gleaming in one hand and a makeshift shield strapped to the other. "You've got terrible timing, princess," he muttered, not taking his eyes off the enforcer as it scrambled to its feet. The enforcer snarled, its predatory confidence replaced by frustration. "A human. You dare interfere?" Ethan smirked. "I don't just dare. I win." The battle that followed was brutal and chaotic. The enforcer was faster and stronger, but Ethan's movements were calculated, his every step designed to exploit a weakness. Lixira watched in awe as he parried blows and counterattacked with precision, his makeshift gear holding up against the alien's advanced weaponry. But it wasn't enough. The enforcer landed a heavy blow, sending Ethan crashing into a tree. He groaned in pain, his shield shattered, and the enforcer advanced, ready to finish him off. Something inside Lixira snapped. A surge of adrenaline, or perhaps something more, coursed through her veins. She grabbed the broken half of her spear and charged, a primal scream tearing from her throat. The enforcer turned just in time to see her leap, her improvised weapon plunging into the exposed joint of its armor. It roared in pain, its weapon clattering to the ground as it staggered back. Ethan seized the opportunity, lunging forward with his machete and delivering a decisive strike to the enforcer's neck. The creature collapsed, its glowing eyes dimming as it let out a final guttural hiss. The forest fell silent once more. Lixira stood frozen, her chest heaving as she stared at the lifeless body. Her hands trembled, the broken spear slipping from her grasp. I killed it," she whispered, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. Ethan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You saved us," he corrected, his voice calm but firm. "If you hadn't acted, we'd both be dead." She turned to him, her eyes wide. "But it shouldn't have been here. It was one of my father's enforcers. He sent them to make sure I don't survive." Ethan frowned, his jaw tightening. "So this wasn't just a test. It's an execution." Lixira nodded, her determination hardening. "If my father thinks I'll die here, he's wrong. I'm going to survive. And when I do, I'll show him the mistake he made." Ethan smirked, his respect for her growing. "Now that's the spirit, princess." As they began to gather their supplies, Lixira felt a strange sensation, a spark of confidence she'd never known before. She wasn't the same frightened girl who had stumbled into the forest days ago. For the first time, she believed she could become something more. A warrior. a survivor, and her father would live to regret underestimating her. The turning point. The morning air was thick with tension as Lixera and Ethan sat by the dying embers of their campfire. The forest, once a cacophony of life, seemed unnervingly quiet after the battle with the Enforcer. Lixera's hand still bore faint stains of alien blood, and her mind replayed the fight over and over, each memory sharpening her resolve. But it wasn't just the fight that haunted her. It was what the Enforcer had revealed. Her father wanted her dead. "You've been quiet," Ethan said, breaking the silence. He leaned against a tree, his mashite resting across his knees as he methodically sharpened the blade. His tone was casual, but his sharp gaze told her he was watching for cracks in her composure. Lixera didn't respond immediately. She stared into the ashes of the fire, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of betrayal and determination. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "I always knew my father was disappointed in me. But to send his enforcers to kill me, I didn't think he'd go that far." Ethan sighed, setting his mashite aside. Disappointment's a hell of a motivator for people like him. They'd rather destroy what they see as weak than admit they were wrong. Lixera clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Then I'll prove him wrong. I'll survive, not for him, but for me. I'm tired of being seen as weak." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good, but surviving isn't just about fighting. It's about adapting, learning, and turning your weaknesses into strengths. If you're serious about this, we start now." She met his gaze, her resolve burning in her eyes. "What do I have to do?" Ethan wasted no time. Their first task of the day was hunting, but not in the way Lixera expected. Instead of using spears or traps, Ethan taught her how to track prey using subtle signs in the environment. The disturbed undergrowth, faint tracks in the dirt, and even the movement of birds. "Every creature leaves a trail," he explained, crouching by a set of hoofprints. "The key is to see what others overlook. Patience is your best weapon." Lixera followed his instructions carefully, her alien senses giving her an unexpected advantage. Her sharp eyes could pick out details Ethan missed, and her heightened hearing allowed her to detect distant sounds. By midday, they had successfully tracked a small deer-like creature. Ethan let her take the lead, watching as she crept closer, her makeshift bow in hand. The shot wasn't perfect. The arrow grazed the animal's side, causing it to bolt. But instead of berating her, Ethan smiled. "You're learning," he said. "Next time, you'll get closer. And the time after that, you'll make the shot." Her frustration melted into determination. For the first time, she felt like she was making progress. That evening, as they sat by the fire with their modest catch cooking over the flames, Ethan broached a subject that had been on his mind. "You know they'll send more, right? Enforcers, bounty hunters, maybe even something worse. If we're going to survive, you need to learn how to fight." Lixera stiffened, her earlier confidence faltering. "I don't know if I can. The Enforcer, it wasn't skill that saved me. It was luck." Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't luck. It was instinct. You've got the spark, Lixera. You just need to fan the flames." He stood, tossing her a sturdy branch. "Come on, let's see what you've got." What followed was hours of grueling training. Ethan pushed her harder than he ever had before, teaching her the basics of combat. Her movements were clumsy at first, but with each correction, she improved. He showed her how to read her opponent's body language, anticipate attacks, and exploit weaknesses. By the time the moon was high in the sky, Lixera was drenched in sweat, her arms trembling from exertion. But there was a spark in her eyes, a glimmer of pride she hadn't felt in years. "Not bad," Ethan said, offering her a canteen of water. "You're a fast learner." She took it gratefully, gulping down the cool liquid. "It's harder than I thought," she admitted. "But it feels right. Like I'm finally doing something that matters." Ethan smirked. "That's because you are." The turning point came a few days later. While setting up camp, they were ambushed by another enforcer, this one larger and more heavily armed than the first. Ethan immediately engaged, but it was clear he was outmatched. The enforcer's blows came fast and hard, and Ethan's defenses began to crumble. Lixera didn't hesitate. Grabbing a weapon from the camp, a knife she had sharpened herself, she leaped into the fray. This time, she didn't fight blindly. She remembered Ethan's teachings, dodging the enforcer's attacks and striking where its armor was weakest. The battle was fierce, but together, they'd brought the enforcer down. As it lay dying, it sneered up at Lixera. "You think you're strong now," it rasped. "Your father will never accept you." Lixera stared down at it, her expression cold. "I don't need his acceptance. I'll make my own place in this galaxy." The enforcer's eyes dimmed, and Lixera turned away, her heart pounding. She felt no guilt, only a deep, unshakable resolve. She wasn't the same weak princess her father had sent to Earth. She was becoming something more, someone who could stand on her own. Ethan clapped a hand on her shoulder, his face a mix of pride and exhaustion. "You've come a long way, princess." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I'm not stopping now." That night, as the fire crackled and the stars glittered above, Lixera silently vowed that this was just the beginning. The weak girl she had once been was gone. In her place was a warrior in the making, one who would prove her worth not to her father, but to herself. The warrior emerges. The sun broke through the treetops, casting golden rays across the forest floor. Lixera stood in a clearing, her grip firm on a spear she had crafted the day before. Unlike her first attempts, this weapon was balanced, sturdy, and designed with intent. The blade at its tip was sharpened to perfection, and its weight felt natural in her hands. Nearby, Ethan leaned against a tree, watching her with an approving nod. "You've come a long way," he said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. "But crafting weapons and swinging them around isn't enough. Today, we take the fight to them." Lixera frowned, turning to him. "To them, you mean?" "Yes," Ethan interrupted, his voice hardening. "Your father's enforcers. They're hunting us, and it's only a matter of time before they find us. But this time, we won't wait for them to come to us. We'll strike first." Her stomach tightened at the thought, but she swallowed her fear. Over the past weeks, she had faced predators, traps, and enforcers sent to kill her. Each challenge had chipped away at the timid princess she had once been, leaving behind someone she barely recognized, a fighter. "How do we find them?" she asked, her voice steady. Ethan smirked, pulling out a small device he had taken from one of the fallen enforcers. "They're not as clever as they think. This tracker still works, and it's picking up their signal. They're camped a few miles from here, probably waiting to regroup before coming for us. We'll hit them while they're vulnerable." Lixera nodded, gripping her spear tighter. "Let's do it." The journey to the enemy camp was grueling. Ethan led the way, moving silently through the dense undergrowth. Lixera followed closely, her senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call felt amplified, her body primed for action. She had never felt this way before, alive, alert, and ready for what lay ahead. When they reached a ridge overlooking the camp, Ethan signaled for her to stop. They crouched behind a cluster of bushes, peering down at the scene below. The enforcer camp was modest, with 3 figures seated around a small fire. Their weapons were stacked nearby, and their guard was down. 3 of them, Ethan murmured. 2 armed with plasma rifles, 1 with a blade. They're distracted now, but the moment we attack, they'll be on high alert. Lixera studied the camp, her mind racing. "We can use the terrain," she whispered. "The rocks on the left give us cover. If I draw their attention, you can flank them." Ethan glanced at her, surprised. "You've been paying attention." "I've had a good teacher," she replied, her lips curling into a small smile. Ethan nodded, his expression turning serious. "All right. You take point. Remember, stick to the plan. And don't hesitate." She didn't need to be told twice. Lixera moved into position, her movements silent and precise. As she crept closer to the camp, she felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was no training exercise. This was life or death. But instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of calm. She was ready. With a deep breath, she stepped into the clearing. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice ringing out across the camp. The enforcers jolted to their feet, their weapons snapping to attention. For a moment, they seemed stunned by the sight of her standing there, bold and unarmed. "It's the princess," one of them hissed. "She's alone." "Not for long," Lixera replied, a hint of defiance in her voice. The enforcers didn't wait for an explanation. The one with the plasma blade charged at her, while the other two fanned out, rifles aimed. Lixera held her ground, waiting until the last possible moment before diving to the side. The blade wielder stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward, and Lixera sprang to her feet, thrusting her spear with precision. The blade found its mark, piercing through the enforcer's armor. The other two opened fire, but their shots went wide as Ethan emerged from the shadows, taking them by surprise. His machete slashed through the first rifle, rendering it useless. The enforcer tried to fight back, but Ethan's brutal efficiency left no room for retaliation. The third enforcer, realizing the tide had turned, attempted to retreat. But Lixera was faster. She sprinted after him, her spear spinning in her hands. When she caught up, she didn't hesitate. With a calculated strike, she knocked the weapon from his hands and delivered a blow to his chest that sent him sprawling. "Please," he gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "I surrender." Lixera loomed over him, her spear poised to strike, every fiber of her being told her to end it, to eliminate the threat once and for all. But then she hesitated, her hands trembling. Was this who she wanted to become? A killer? Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "Lixera, it's your choice, but whatever you do, make sure it's a decision you can live with." She stared at the enforcer, her mind racing. Finally, she lowered her spear. "Get out of here," she said coldly, "and tell my father I'm not afraid of him." The enforcer scrambled to his feet and fled, disappearing into the forest. Lixera turned to Ethan, who gave her a nod of approval. "Mercy can be a strength too," he said. As they gathered the spoils of their victory, Lixera felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, relief, and a flicker of doubt. She had faced her enemies and won, but the path she was on felt darker with every step. That night, as they sat by their campfire, Ethan handed her a piece of bread and said, "You're not the same person who landed here, you know." Lixera stared at the fire, her voice soft. "I'm not sure if that's a good thing." Ethan smirked. "It is. Trust me." For the first time, Lixera began to believe him. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming something more. And the galaxy would soon know it. Return to the throne. The vast expanse of stars shimmered through the viewport of the alien starship as it cut through the void. Lixera stood at the helm, her gaze fixed on the distant speck that was her homeworld. She was no longer the frail princess who had been exiled to Earth. Her once delicate frame was now lean and powerful, her every movement radiating confidence. The scars on her hands, reminders of the trials she had endured, were marks of pride, not shame. Behind her, Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Nervous?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Lixera glanced over her shoulder. "Not anymore. Whatever happens, I'm ready." Ethan nodded. "Good, because this isn't just about facing your father. It's about proving to yourself that you're more than what he thought you were." She smiled faintly. "I already know that. Now it's time for him to see it." The starship descended through the golden skies of Zarinthia, its engines humming with power. As it approached the royal palace, its landing platform bristled with activity. Guards in ornate armor hurried to prepare for the unexpected arrival, their weapons raised in suspicion. The ship's ramp hissed as it lowered, and Lixera emerged, flanked by Ithan and the battle-worn trophies she had brought back from Earth, her spear, her salvaged armor, and a captured plasma rifle. The gathered nobles gasped as they recognized the princess, their whispers growing louder. "She's alive. Impossible. She was supposed to die. How did she survive?" Lixura ignored them, her stride unbroken as she approached the grand doors of the throne room. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to stop her, but the sheer force of her presence left them rooted in place. The doors swung open with a thunderous creak, revealing the alien king seated on his imposing throne. His piercing eyes locked onto Lixura, his expression unreadable. The room fell silent as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing against the polished crystal floor. "So," the king said, his voice cold and measured, "you return." Lixura stopped at the base of the throne, her chin held high. "I return not as the weak daughter you exiled, but as the warrior you never believed I could be." The king leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "And what proof do you bring of this so-called transformation?" Without a word, Lixura gestured to Ethan, who stepped forward and placed the plasma rifle and the enforcer's insignia at the king's feet. The nobles gasped again, recognizing the marks of her victories. "These belong to your enforcers," Lixura said, "the ones you sent to ensure I didn't survive. They underestimated me, just as you did." The king's expression hardened, though he said nothing. Lixura continued, her voice steady, but laced with emotion. "All my life, you told me I was weak, unworthy. You protected me not out of love, but out of shame. When you exiled me, you thought you were sending me to my death. But instead, you gave me the chance to become something greater." She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "I survived Earth. I learned to fight, to endure, to lead. And now, I stand before you, not as your daughter, but as someone who has proven herself." The room was silent, the tension thick. Finally, the king rose from his throne, his towering figure casting a long shadow. He descended the steps, his expression unreadable as he stopped mere inches from Lixura. "You speak with conviction," he said, his voice low. "But words mean nothing without action. If you truly wish to prove your worth, then show me." Before Lixura could respond, the king unsheathed a blade from his side, a ceremonial weapon etched with ancient symbols. He held it out to her, his gaze challenging. Lixura understood the unspoken test. She took the blade without hesitation, its weight familiar in her hands. The king stepped back, raising his own weapon. The throne room erupted into motion as the two clashed. The king's strikes were precise and powerful, his years of experience evident in every move. But Lixura was faster, her movements honed by the harsh lessons of Earth. She deflected his blows, her strikes calculated and unrelenting. The nobles watched in stunned silence as the battle unfolded. For the first time, they saw Lixura not as the frail princess, but as a warrior who could hold her own against the king himself. Finally, with a swift maneuver, Lixura disarmed her father, his blade clattering to the floor. She pointed her weapon at him, her breathing steady despite the exertion. The king stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he smiled, a small, genuine smile. "You've surpassed my expectations," he said quietly. "I underestimated you, Lixura. That was my mistake." He stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "You've proven yourself worthy, not just of survival, but of leadership." Lixura lowered the blade, her chest heaving with relief. She turned to the gathered nobles, her voice ringing out. "This is not about proving myself to him. It's about proving that strength comes not from titles or power, but from resilience and determination. I have fought, I have endured, and I have risen. If that is not enough for you, then nothing will be." The room erupted into applause, the nobles bowing their heads in respect. Lixura looked back at her father, who nodded in approval. "The throne will be yours one day," he said, "and you will rule as a warrior." That night, as Lixera stood on the palace balcony overlooking the city, Ethan joined her. "Well," he said, leaning on the railing, "looks like you got what you came for." Lixera smiled faintly. "Not just what I came for. What I earned." Ethan chuckled. "Fair enough. So what now?" She looked out at the stars, her heart swelling with pride and purpose. "Now, I lead. Not as my father's daughter, but as the warrior I've become." And in that moment, Lixera knew her journey was only just beginning.